Howdy there, folks. Today we're going to start building out the auth page, which will contain a form that can handle signing in and signing up users. We'll also add validation to our view form using a library called Vee-Validate. Now, I decided to use an updated or latest version of this library, version 4, to take their new composable functions for a spin. At this point, I kind of regret that decision, but I guess I'm a sucker for the latest and greatest. But let's hang in there, because knowing how to work with forms and how to include validation is probably a daily hassle for you all front-end and full-stacky folks out there. But before we really get into the meat of things, I've been able to use the script validation in Validator, and let me tell you what I'm referring to here. Basically, Validator is my extension in VS Code. I've been able to use it to validate these scripts quite well while working with TypeScript. And Validator says that it supports some Vue essential ESLint rules out of the box, but I was having trouble getting it to work with VS Code. Therefore, I'm going to hopefully quickly install ESLint and a Vue ESLint plugin for this application to improve the linting experience. And we're going to do so inside of the account client folder of the root memorizer folder. So we'll run npm install, and as dev dependencies, we'll install ESLint and ESLint plugin Vue. And then we can create in this account client folder an ESLint.rc file. You can make this, JSON or I think YAML or just JavaScript. I guess at least JSON or JavaScript. I don't know about YAML. And let's add some basic rules. And we're just going to extend your basic JavaScript recommended rules from ESLint and use that Vue 3 plugin we installed. And then I'm going to add a new rule for no unused variables. I'm going to make it a level 1 rule, which means it's a warning instead of an error. And basically, this will allow us to prefix any unused variables with an underscore. I don't know whether we'll use this or not, but I like to do that in my projects. And as a note, I'm not going to be using the build tool for linting. Like if you're in the Vue CLI Webpack project, you might see linting down in your console here. I'm actually using an extension of VS Code for the actual linting warnings. So let's save this. I may need to restart this, we'll see, and let's get moving. I've created this views folder for the main pages of our application. Today we're going to be working on this auth.view component, and this component will manage most of the business logic for authenticating a user. So it will interact with the API and manage the state with the business logic, although inside of this, we will put the actual form, which will handle its own validation. As an example, this component will maintain state for whether we want to be in login mode or sign up mode, whether or not the user is authenticated, and it will also hold some state for any errors when reaching out to the API. And I guess we'll probably add a loading state for fetching that data as well. And we'll end up doing a lot of this logic in a separate store or state management solution in the next tutorial. Let's install the packages necessary for this tutorial before we start really doing any templating. Make sure you're in the account client folder, and let's install the latest version of Vee-Validate so you can use Vee-Validate at next. And then I'm also going to install this light package of rules. And this basically contains some run-of-the-mill or basic validation rules like for email addresses or passwords, or confirming password matches the first password, meaning if you confirm your password, you make sure the two match, and things for like the length of the fields that you enter. A lot of times I might write my own validation rules, but I wanted to play with this library, so let's do this. And the reason I might write my own validation rules is just to make sure that they line up with the backend exactly the same. Let's now change up to the root directory by going up one directory, and let's run docker compose to run this project, or all of the project, and then we'll run up. And then I always like to rebuild because sometimes, you need to make sure that the newly installed npm packages are built into the image. All right, so it looks like everything is up and running. This is our API. It looks like our page already loaded and tried to fetch a route without authorization. And our client is also up and running. And remember, I'm not running on localhost. It is, but I'm forwarding it through traffic on this malcorp.test/account. And let's maybe expand this just a couple percent. I guess I already did, but just so you can see it all well. And let's go to the auth page here. And right now, it just says auth. And we can see this here. Inside of here, we're going to create an outer card component that will contain the form. You might make the card a part of the form, but I want to put the state for whether we're in login or sign up mode inside of the card. So we'll put this logic and that templating inside of this auth.view component. So let's remove this. And I'm just going to put some card that lets it be up to the max width of an extra large screen. It'll have some padding on the right and left, and it will be centered, and it'll have a little bit of rounded edges with some shadow and then margin inside of the card. And right now, it'll just say dummy content inside. So let's save that. And there we go. We have our dummy content. The next thing I want to do is replace this dummy content with some buttons to toggle login and sign up, as you can see in this comment. So we're going to make an unordered list and a couple of list items inside. Now, right now, you're going to get some errors because I'm using some state, which does not exist inside of our view script yet. But basically what we just have here is some items that if we click, this will set it to login mode. And you can see that the label of this little button will be login, or this list item. And then the second list item will say sign up, and it will set login to false. So basically you can only be in login or sign up. So I just use a true or false state. And then we have some custom classes that will bind to whether we're in login mode or not. And basically this will just put a little blue border highlighted under the text, either sign up or login. But we can't see that until we add some logic. So let's do that now. Let's scroll down. And beneath this name here, let's add some basics. And in fact, we need to import the ref type, which allows us to track reactively the Boolean state of whether we are logged in or signing up. I should say logging in or signing up. And then we'll add a setup function, which is for how we use the composition API. And I'll paste some code in here. What we have again is this is login state. And remember, that's what we have in this template. Then we're going to make a method to change the login value. And in Vue, when we're using a ref to change a value, we access its value property. So in Vue, we use mutation to change a ref. I'll make a little function later. And what this will allow us to do is to end up sending auth data to the server. But right now, we're not going to do any of that. So basically, our login form that we'll create will fire an event. And when that event is fired with an email and password, we'll call this method eventually. To get access to these methods and data inside our template, we need to return them. And that's how we get access to set is login and is login in the template. Let's save this and see what it looks like. So you see we have a little login. There's even a little hover effect. And we can toggle between these two. Great. Let's now get to work on that login form. And we'll do that inside of this empty components folder. And we'll call this login form.view. I'm going to quickly add a little bit of template and script here. Excellent. So right now it's just going to say the login form. We're going to wrap the data or the actual exported view object in defined component. So it gives us some nice typing help. We'll call it login form, and then we'll define the prop that it accepts. So remember that auth component defines whether we're in login mode or sign up mode. So we'll pass that to this component. And then we're also going to pass a Boolean for if the form is submitting. So that's when we reach out to the API, we can use a loader or something. This component will also emit a submit auth event. So when we end up clicking, submit the form, when it's validated, then it will fire this event with some data. And this null basically means that we're not going to validate the data in this event. So we could, inside of this event, make sure we have an email field and a password field and actually do like a double validation inside of here. But since we're not going to do that, you set it to null. And we have an empty setup function. Let's now make this component with the title, the login form, exist inside of our auth component. So what do you need to do? You need to go back to auth and import the component and add it to a components field of your export. Let's import the login form beneath this one. And then to add it, you need to add it to this components object inside of define component. So we'll add it here maybe. And so we'll add the login form right there. And what is this warning? This is saying it's registered but unused. Perfect. So we now need to add a login form to our template in place of this. Excellent. Here's our login form, and we bind to the is login prop, is login, and then remember we created that custom event, submit auth, and when it fires, it will call the auth submitted from this component. Let's save that and go back to make sure we have at least some text saying the login form in our app component. The next thing I want to do now is inside of the source folder, I want to create some global validators for the project. And by that, I mean global Vee-Validate validators that can be used anywhere in the application. Maybe this isn't necessary because we're really doing validation only in a couple spots in this sign-in form. And then later we'll have like an edit user details form. Let's call this validators.js. And again, I'm going to quickly add some code and go over it. And this is actually a little bit more complex. And I'll save. To define rules globally in Vee-Validate, we have to call this function define rule and give it a name. Now, Vee-Validate, its rules package that you can install separately, which we did, already has an email field. But what I'm kind of doing in these is taking the value in the input form and then combining rules. So I want this rule to be a sort of email and required rule. So I check if the email is there, and we pass the required validator, then we return true. So you return true if the field is valid. Otherwise, I'm going to return a string saying a valid email address is required. For the password, we do something similar, that it's required and that its length must be between 6 and 30. Otherwise, we return this handy dandy message. And the one that's a little more complex is this confirm password. So the value is the value like the user enters in the input. So we want to make sure that's required. This target is actually defined in the template. So in the template, in our confirm password field, we'll put a colon and then the name of the password field we want it to match. And then the context gives us access to an entire form. So basically one field can reference another field. And so we make sure if the value is there, if it passes the required validator, and then we want to make sure the value entered equals the form's target field. So we get this sort of map here or object with access to a target field. And we define this target again in the template when we build the component out. And if it's false, we say that the passwords must match. Now, how to turn the confirm password validator on and off, we'll see shortly, because when you're signing in, you don't want to confirm a password. But when you're signing up, you obviously do. And the suggested way to use this, I don't know if I like this, but the suggested way to use this is to go to your main.js file and then to import all of these validators globally. So all we need to do is use an import and then reference that validators.js file. So these rules are now globally accessible. Let's now define some of the logic. We're going to use two imports from Vee-Validate in order to do this. One is use field, and that gives us data and tracks the actual data in each individual field. And then the other is a use form composable, and that will give us access to the combined form state. Is the entire form valid? And it'll also give us a method to submit the form, which kind of will stop submitting the form if it's invalid. Inside the setup function, I'm going to add a lot, but don't worry too much. We'll go over it. So here it is. And of course, I've missed some important imports here. Let's fix all this one by one. First of all, our setup method gets access to props, and then it gets access to a context. And on this context, you get the emit function, which allows us to emit this submit auth event, or any event really. Now the props, you may be used to like working in React and then destructuring them, but that actually breaks the reactivity in Vue. So in Vue, you need to provide the entire props. Now, if I go back to my browser, of course I have an error, but if we go to view, the information about the props is in this props section of the reactivity guide. And I really recommend you check out this reactivity guide. And as you can see, because props are reactive, you cannot use ES6 destructuring because it will remove props reactivity. And if you really need to destructure, you would use this toRefs on props inside of your setup function. While we're here, I just want to throw out, this is the Vee-Validation guide. I found that I had to go a lot straight to the API reference. Some of the examples were a little too elementary for what I was trying to do. All right, back to the project after that aside. There's some types that we need to import from Vue here, and let me do that. Let's scroll up. And so we don't just need define component. I'm going to paste this quickly to save some time, but we need the reactive, which makes a field observable in the template as sort of an object instead of a single field. There are two reactive types or main reactive types in Vue. One is called reactive and the other is called ref. And then a computed and a watch. And so these kind of match the watch and computed properties of the normal Vue options API, where you might, instead of creating a setup function, you would create watch or computed here. But instead, we can define these in the setup function, which we'll see right now. Here is the use of that use form hook or composable. And it has a meta field and a handle submit and some more fields. The meta field, I'll just rename it form meta. And this gives us overall state of the form. Has the form been touched or is it dirty? Oh, look, there are the properties right there. And you could also see initial values, which you could set for it. We're mainly going to just be using, is the entire form valid, to enable or disable a button for submitting the form. I briefly mentioned handle submit. This allows us to kind of stop submission of the form if it's not valid. So the method will not get handled or called if the form is invalid. So we wrap our actual handling functionality in this handle submit function. Then we create individual fields. I have two here and a third one here. So the first one is an email field, which we'll call it email. And then the second one is to use that global validator that we created in validators.js. The same for password. And I wrap these in reactive because this use field actually provides reactive information. So it provides the name, the value, the meta, etc. So basically, like this metadata and errors and all this data is reactive. So you can use object destructuring right here to get all these fields, and you can use them directly in the template. But if you want to use the whole object, it's not reactive. So I guess it's kind of opposite of these props. Therefore, I wrapped these in the reactive property. It was just getting to the point where destructuring all of these and then renaming them, because I'm using the use field 3 times. So I had to like get the metadata and then call it email meta, kind of like we did right here. And so it was just way too much object destructuring. So, you know, we all love our object destructuring, but sometimes it's a bad thing. Now, here for this validator confirm password field, remember, we only want this to exist if the user is in sign up mode and not sign in mode. Hence, we pass it this confirm password validator, which you see here is a computed property. So we use this computed and we pass it a function. And then we say if it is not login mode, then we want to confirm the password. And this is the colon, meaning on the password field. So we want our confirm password field to match this password field's data. Otherwise, we want it to always return true. So if we're in login mode, this validator is true, we can submit our form. We then create a watcher. And so the first parameter of the watcher is the field that we want to watch, and that is the is login prop. Now, you could pass a ref reactive type. There's a lot of nuance and trickiness with Vue's reactivity API, I'm not going to lie. But since the props is not a ref, we can't pass it directly to the first parameter. Let's see if you can see that here. I guess it's called a watch source for the first parameter. Anyway, it's a little tricky, but you could pass a ref directly here, or you can pass a function that returns a value that you want to watch. And as the second parameter, we pass a function that says what we want to do when this changes. And in this case, we want to confirm the password field's validate. And this just kind of fixed an edge case when if we started to use the sign in form or log in form and then switched over to the sign up form, the form would be initially valid just because of how Vee-Validate handles a non-dirty form field. So basically, since we haven't even started to type inside of the confirm password field, it will consider it valid until we've started typing. We then have a submit form function here, which basically calls that handle submit function from use form. And it gets the form values, and then we'll emit that event that will be sent up to the auth component with the email and password. And we return all the data that we'll need access to in our template, which we'll now create. Now, I probably should have done this more piece by piece. I can see that this is getting a little hard to understand without having to add any of the templates. So sorry about that, guys. All right, so let's add some template here. So I'll just initially save this, and then we'll go to the browser and we'll come back and forth and see what all of this is. So first we have this H1 tag with some markup, some semi-bold large text or extra large text. And if we're in login mode, we want to show the title login, otherwise sign up. Let's see that. Some error. Let's try refreshing. It appears I had some problem building this. Sometimes I get trouble with that. Let's try rebuilding the application. It's not seeing my Vee-Validate that I installed. Probably I did something wrong in the Docker config. Okay, so I've rerun this in my actual terminal, and for some reason now I see that it's bundled Vee-Validate in all of the libraries. I don't know why it wasn't using Vee-Validate when I was running it in this terminal, but so be it. I have this running in my other terminal. Okay, so we're here at our login form inside of Authenticate, and we have this little sign in button here, which doesn't look marked up right. We'll fix this in a moment. I need to add some CSS. But here is the login or sign up title I just showed. So if we go to sign up mode, it says sign up. If we go to login, it says login. And notice also we have something similar here, and I'll probably need to update this button to say sign up in the case of sign up. And then we have our validation. And you see once it's dirty, if we've touched it and go back, then it says the field is required. So let's see all this. All right, we're at this field. So first we have an input field. And remember, we passed the entire email field's data to the template. The first import is a field that has a placeholder that said email address. And then when we change input, we're going to use a handle change method, which basically detects that we've dirtied the field and then revalidates the input. And if we blur, meaning we like click away to another field, it'll have an event called handle blur, which will also set the field's blur value to blurred. And then we want to bind the value of this input to email field.value. We add a whole bunch of styles. When the field is highlighted or focused, you see we add a little outline. And then when there's an error, we create a paragraph with some centered red text, which you probably briefly saw. And we make this field valid if the meta touched field, meaning we've already started to type or moved away from this field, is true, and if it is not valid. So if it's not valid, then we show the error message. And in case we don't have a message from the validator yet, meaning remember how we didn't try to fill anything in here? And this is a good example, but then we toggled away. Maybe let's refresh this actually. So if I click this, there's not going to be a validator message yet from those validators we created, but the field will have been blurred if I click password. And in this case, we want to show field is required. And then again, I clicked away from this one, so it showed a message here as well. And so if I start to type email address, now it'll say a valid email address is required. Now it's only that aggressive because I've blurred the field, but if I start typing, my email, Jacob Goodwood, maybe I won't put my email address, but now you all know it. Then there we go. And here's a password. Blah, blah, blah. All right. And we'll handle this in a minute. And sign up as well. All right. So next we add a second input for the password with some placeholder password. Then if the input changes, we're going to call a handle change event, and we're also going to validate the confirm password field. So why are we doing it like this? Why are we passing two events to our input handler? And note that you can do that with a comma between two events. We're doing that because we want to make sure we also validate the confirm password field whenever we change the password field. We add a blur handler and bind the value as we did before, and the rest is very similar, so please pause the video and take a look. Then we're going to add sort of what we might call a fragment if you're coming from React land, and we're going to basically create a template that is shown, so a template inside of a template, which is going to be shown if we're not in login mode, in other words, if we're signing up. And this will basically be of type password. It will say confirm password with default text. We handle changes in a similar manner, and that's about it. Remember, we handled using this validator only if we're not in login mode. We handled that in the setup function. And then some text to show this field if it's invalid. Now remember, this sign in button, I actually want to change it. I'm using the term login. Sorry if I interchangeably use them. But let's add some logic here to say if it's login here. So props. Actually, we don't need to type props. So if it is login, then we'll call this login. Otherwise, we'll say sign up. And the error here, I think, is that I need a question mark and not a colon. All right, let's save this. Don't know why I lost my mind there. And so this button now says sign up or login, depending on the state. Now there's a little custom CSS, not the Consumer Electronics Show, but cascaded style sheets. As you can see in this button here, I've called it a button and button blue. These are not defined. So I want to show you how you can create some basic CSS that can be applied. Basically, it can combine Tailwind styles into a single style with something called an add apply directive. So let's go back. I don't know if it's called a directive, but let's create or look at this index.css file. And basically, we can extend these components, base, and utilities with our own styles. I forgot to include this in the script, but here's what we will add. We're going to add two buttons. So we're going to modify this components. And so we use this add apply to take other Tailwind CSS styles and kind of combine them into a button style. So we'll add like a disabled style, cursor's not allowed, and it's a little grayed out with a lighter opacity. And then we have a focus style, and then we'll have a blue button and a gray button, as well as handling the hover for these blue and gray buttons. So I'll save this, and hopefully if we go back to our project, we'll have some button styles. And it takes a little longer to update Tailwind CSS, which is using post CSS under the hood. But now you can see we have a login button. And if I take out some characters here and it's less than 6, you see it's grayed out and we can't click it. And if I go to sign up, it's also disabled. So let's now maybe make this say blah, blah, blah. It's more than 6 characters and blah, blah, blah. And we should be able to click sign up. Now, what happens if we click sign up? Just a reminder. Let's go back to login form. If we click this button, we're going to call submit form. And submit form is wrapped with handle submit, and it's going to emit the submit auth method. And this method will be handled in auth.view. And we're basically just going to console.log if we're in login mode or sign up mode, and then the email and the password. Let's see if that works. And so I will open the console here. I was hitting the Mac command because I switch back and forth between Mac and Windows. And let's click sign up. And so the first value is the isLogin. And so this ref is just the view reactive object for if we're in login mode or not. But the value is false here. Or yeah, value false. And then it shows the email address and the password. We'll be ready to connect this up with the logic in the next tutorial. So thanks for sticking around. I know that was a pretty tedious one with a lot of markup, but this is something we all have to deal with. Thanks for hanging in there. Until next time, ciao.